Right before we dive in, let's make this story bigger than just me and you. Tell me in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from, and what's the clock striking there? Morning, night, or somewhere in between, I want to see how far this story can reach. Now lean closer. Here's where it all begins. The poker chip bounced off Étienne's forehead with a sharp crack that silenced the entire Silver Dollar Saloon. The young cowboy's twisted left leg, mangled from a childhood riding accident, buckled beneath him as he tried to stand, sending him crashing into a table of half-drunk miners. Their beer spilled across the sawdust floor, and the sound of breaking glass mixed with cruel laughter that cut through the smoky air like a blade. "Look at the cripple dance!" roared Bull Morrison, the biggest of the three cattle barons who had cornered Étienne near the bar. The man's fleshy face was red with whiskey and malice as he flicked another chip at the fallen cowboy. "Maybe if you crawl real nice-like, we'll let you clean up this mess with your tongue." His companions, Snake Dalton and Razor Pete, joined in the laughter, their expensive boots forming a circle around Étienne like vultures around carrion. Every eye in the saloon was fixed on the scene, but nobody moved to help. These weren't ordinary bullies. They were the Crimson Creek Gang, men who owned half the territory and had killed the other half into submission. Even the bartender, old Henri Baptiste, found sudden interest in polishing glasses, his weathered hands shaking as he pretended not to see the humiliation unfolding just feet away from his bar. Étienne struggled to his knees, his face burning with shame as hot as the desert sun. At 19, he had endured a lifetime of mockery for his damaged leg, but never in front of an entire saloon full of witnesses. He could feel their stares boring into his back like hot irons, some pitying, others merely curious about how far the torture would go. The silver dollar Morrison had won from him in the rigged poker game lay on the floor beside his hat, his last coin, meant for medicine his sick sister Celeste desperately needed. In the far corner of the saloon, a figure stirred in the shadows. A tall man in a black duster had been sitting alone at a corner table, so still and quiet that most folks had forgotten he was there. His hat was pulled low over his eyes, and his hands rested motionless on the table like he was praying or preparing. As Morrison raised his boot to kick Étienne in the ribs, the stranger's chair scraped against the floor with a sound that somehow carried over all the noise and laughter. Every head in the saloon turned toward that dark corner, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. 3 hours earlier, Étienne Dubois had ridden into Serpent's Hollow with nothing but hope and his sister's fevered words echoing in his ears. Celeste had been burning with sickness for a week, her beautiful face pale as desert bone. And the town doctor had demanded $20 for the medicine that could save her life. $20 might as well have been $20,000 for a ranch hand who earned $3 a month working the most dangerous jobs no other cowboy would take. The Silver Dollar Saloon had seemed like salvation when Étienne heard about the high-stakes poker game. He wasn't much of a gambler, but desperation had a way of making even the longest odds seem reasonable. With his father's silver dollar clutched in his sweaty palm, the only thing of value he owned, Étienne had limped through those swinging doors with determination stronger than his damaged leg could ever be. The Crimson Creek Gang had welcomed him to their table with smiles that should have warned him of danger. Bull Morrison's gap-toothed grin was friendly enough, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who viewed other people as cattle to be herded and slaughtered. Snake Dalton, thin as a whip and twice as dangerous, had dealt the cards with the smooth precision of someone who had been cheating at poker since before Étienne was born. For the first few hands, luck seemed to favor the young cowboy. His silver dollar grew to 2, then 5, then 10, as the cards fell his way, and Morrison's jovial laughter filled the smoky air. Étienne had allowed himself to dream of Celeste's recovery, of the medicine that would bring color back to her cheeks and strength back to her voice. He had imagined riding home as a hero instead of the family burden he had always been. But then the trap had sprung with the inevitable cruelty of a steel bear trap closing on a rabbit's leg. The cards had turned against him with mathematical precision, and within an hour, Étienne's silver dollar was sitting in Bull Morrison's pile alongside bills worth more than most men saw in a year. When the young cowboy had tried to leave, Morrison had grabbed his wrist with a hand like a vice and suggested they play one more hand, double or nothing, with Étienne's dignity as the stakes. The man in the corner had been watching the poker game from the moment Étienne sat down, though his face remained hidden beneath the brim of his black hat. His hands never moved from their position on the table, fingers interlaced like he was holding something precious between his palms. The other patrons gave his table a wide berth, sensing something in his stillness that spoke of coiled violence and patient death. When Morrison had first started his cruel display, the stranger's breathing had changed, not faster or slower, but deeper, like a man preparing for something that required all his strength. His shoulders had shifted almost imperceptibly beneath the black duster, and the silver spurs on his boots had clinked once against the chair legs before falling silent again. These were small movements that meant nothing to casual observers, but everything to anyone who knew the language of professional killers. The bartender, Henri, had noticed the stranger first, recognizing something in the man's bearing that made his old soldier's instincts scream warnings. There was a weight to the figure that went beyond physical presence, an authority that didn't need words or gestures to make itself known. Henri had seen men like this before, during his cavalry days, and they all shared the same terrible quality. They were survivors who had looked death in the eye so many times that they no longer feared it. As Morrison's boot swung toward Étienne's ribs, the stranger finally moved. His chair pushed back from the table with deliberate slowness, the legs scraping against the floorboards like nails on a coffin lid. He stood with the fluid grace of a man who had spent years learning to move without wasted motion, each muscle perfectly controlled and ready for action. His right hand hung loose at his side, fingers relaxed, but positioned exactly where they needed to be. The sound of his boots on the saloon floor was like thunder in the sudden silence. Each step carried the weight of inevitability, measured and purposeful as a funeral march. Morrison's foot froze in mid-kick as every eye in the saloon turned toward the approaching figure, and even Snake Dalton's confident sneer began to falter. The stranger was still 20 feet away, but somehow his presence filled the entire room like smoke from a prairie fire. Recognition dawned slowly in Henri's weathered eyes as the stranger stepped into the yellow glow of the oil lamps. The bartender's face went pale as desert sand, and his hands began trembling so violently that he nearly dropped the glass he was holding. "Mother of God," he whispered in French, the words barely audible above the labored breathing of 30 frightened men. "That's Gabriel Montclair." The name hit the saloon like a lightning strike, passing from lip to lip in hushed whispers that grew more urgent with each repetition. Gabriel Montclair, the ghost of Abilene, the man who had single-handedly ended the bloody Kansas War by putting 6 bullets through 6 hearts in 6 seconds. Stories said he had killed 40 men in fair fights, and twice that many who hadn't been sporting enough to face him head-on. The legends painted him as either an angel of justice or a demon of vengeance, depending on which side of his guns you found yourself facing. Morrison's face lost its ruddy color as the implications settled in his whiskey-soaked brain. He had heard the stories, too. Everyone in the territory had heard them. Gabriel Montclair was the gunslinger who appeared when justice failed and disappeared when balance was restored. Men said he could draw and fire faster than lightning could strike, that his bullets never missed their intended targets, that he moved through the world like death itself looking for appointments to keep. Snake Dalton's thin fingers twitched toward his gun, then froze as Gabriel's cold blue eyes fixed on him with the intensity of a hawk studying a mouse. There was no emotion in that gaze. No anger or hatred, just the clinical assessment of a professional evaluating potential obstacles. Dalton had killed 12 men in gunfights, but looking into those eyes, he suddenly felt like a child playing with toys he didn't understand. Razor Pete, the youngest of the three gang members, took an involuntary step backward and immediately cursed himself for showing fear. But Gabriel Montclair's reputation preceded him like the smell of gunpowder and grave dirt, and Pete had no desire to become another notch on the legend's already crowded belt. The silence in the saloon was so complete that the sound of Pete's breathing seemed loud as a bellows, and sweat began beading on his forehead despite the evening chill. Gabriel stopped exactly 10 feet from Morrison's group, close enough to see the fear in their eyes, but far enough to give himself room to work. His positioning was perfect, no obstacles behind him, clear lines of sight to all three targets, and enough space to move in any direction if the situation escalated. Every aspect of his stance spoke to years of experience in situations where the difference between life and death was measured in fractions of seconds. Morrison tried to summon his usual bluster, puffing out his chest and forcing a laugh that sounded like a dying coyote. Well, he said, his voice cracking slightly on the second word. The famous Gabriel Montclair, gracing our little saloon with his presence. What brings you to Serpent's Hollow, stranger? Looking for someone to kill, or just passing through? The bravado was paper-thin, a desperate attempt to maintain face in front of his men and the watching crowd. Gabriel's response was silence. Not the absence of words, but their complete and utter rejection. He stood motionless as a gravestone, his presence more eloquent than any speech could ever be. His message was clear to anyone who knew how to read the signs. Some situations didn't require discussion, only resolution. The time for talking had passed the moment Morrison raised his boot toward a defenseless man. The other patrons began edging toward the walls and the door, recognizing the signs that preceded sudden violence. Henri quietly moved the good whiskey to safety behind the bar, while the piano player slowly closed the lid over the keys and slipped away from his bench. These were men who had seen gunfights before, and they knew that when Gabriel Montclair appeared, smart people found cover and stayed out of the way. Étienne struggled to his feet, using a chair for support as his damaged leg protested the movement. He looked between Gabriel and his tormentors with the confusion of a man who couldn't understand why a legend would involve himself in the troubles of a nobody. The silver dollar still lay on the floor beside his hat, gleaming in the lamplight like a fallen star. But suddenly it seemed like the least important thing in the room. "You got some business with us, stranger?" Snake Dalton asked, his voice steady but his right hand drifting closer to his gun butt. He was trying to gauge Gabriel's intentions without appearing to back down, walking the razor's edge between caution and cowardice. "Because if you don't, I suggest you find yourself another table and let us finish our conversation with the cripple here." Gabriel's eyes shifted to Dalton with the slow deliberation of a gun barrel tracking its target. The movement was minimal, just a slight turn of his head, but it carried the weight of an executioner's axe. Still, he said nothing, allowing his silence to speak louder than any threat or warning. The message was crystal clear. There would be no conversation, no negotiation, no chance for the gang to walk away and pretend this hadn't happened. Morrison's desperation began showing through his facade of confidence. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air, and his hands shook slightly as he gestured toward Étienne. "This ain't your fight, Montclair. Boy here lost fair and square in a poker game, and now he's paying the price for his poor judgment. No law against teaching a lesson to someone who plays above his station." The accusation of cheating hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and Gabriel's expression changed for the first time since he had stood up. It wasn't anger that crossed his features. It was something far more dangerous. The legendary gunslinger had built his reputation on fair play and honest dealing, and Morrison's implication that the card game had been legitimate was more than an insult. It was a declaration of war. Razor Pete made the first mistake, his nerves finally snapping under the pressure of Gabriel's silent scrutiny. His hand jerked toward his gun in an involuntary spasm of fear, and though he caught himself before drawing, the movement was enough. Gabriel's right hand moved with liquid speed, not toward his own weapon, but to his hat. He removed it with ceremonial precision and placed it carefully on a nearby table, revealing steel-gray hair and eyes like winter storms. The gesture was simple, but every man in the saloon understood its meaning. The killing was about to begin. Henri Baptiste had served drinks to killers, outlaws, and desperados for 30 years. But he had never seen anything like the transformation that came over Gabriel Montclair when he removed his hat. The man's face was a map of old violence, scars that told stories of knife fights and bullet wounds, lines etched by years of squinting down gun barrels in desert sun and prairie snow. But it was his eyes that made Henri cross himself and whisper a prayer in rapid French. Those eyes held the accumulated weight of every life Gabriel had taken, every decision that had ended with smoke and blood and empty holsters. They were the eyes of a man who had stared into the abyss so many times that it had stared back, marking him with a coldness that went deeper than winter. When those eyes fixed on Morrison's face, the big man actually whimpered, a sound that escaped his throat before he could stop it. Snake Dalton tried one last desperate gambit, pulling a derringer from his sleeve and pointing it at Étienne's head. "Stay back, Montclair, or the cripple dies," he snarled, pressing the small gun against the young cowboy's temple. "I don't care how fast you are. You can't outdraw a bullet that's already cocked and ready." His thin face was slick with sweat, and his hand trembled as he tried to use Étienne as a human shield. Gabriel's response was immediate and terrifying. He smiled, not with warmth or humor, but with the cold satisfaction of a predator who had just been given permission to kill. The expression transformed his weathered features into something almost demonic, promising pain that would make dying seem like mercy. "Boy," he said, speaking for the first time since entering the saloon, "you just made this personal." The voice that emerged from Gabriel's throat was like gravel sliding down a mountainside, rough, inexorable, and carrying the promise of burial. He began walking forward again, each step measured and purposeful despite the gun pressed against Étienne's head. His confidence was absolute, the bearing of a man who had faced impossible odds so many times that they no longer impressed him. Morrison and Pete backed away instinctively, leaving Dalton alone with his hostage and his rapidly crumbling nerve. What happened next would be talked about in Serpent's Hollow for decades, passed down from fathers to sons like a secular gospel of justice and retribution. Gabriel moved with speed that defied human comprehension, his hand flowing to his gun like water finding its level. The Colt appeared in his grip as if materialized by magic, the barrel already tracking toward its target before Dalton's finger could tighten on his derringer's trigger. The shot was impossibly precise, a bullet that threaded the needle between Étienne's ear and Dalton's wrist, shattering bone and sending the derringer spinning across the saloon floor. Dalton screamed and clutched his ruined hand to his chest, his face going white with shock and pain. The speed of Gabriel's draw had been inhuman, the accuracy supernatural, and the message unmistakable. He could have killed Dalton just as easily as disarming him. Morrison and Pete went for their guns simultaneously, their survival instincts finally overriding their fear. Morrison's Remington cleared leather a fraction of a second before Pete's Colt, both men fast enough to make their living as professional killers. But Gabriel moved like lightning made flesh, his left hand joining his right on his gun as he fanned the hammer with movements too quick for the eye to follow. Two shots rang out in perfect sequence, so close together they almost sounded like one. Morrison's bullet went wild, punching through the saloon's ceiling as his gun hand jerked skyward, a red flower blooming on his shoulder where Gabriel's first shot had found its mark. Pete's shot never came at all. Gabriel's second bullet took him through the right shoulder, spinning him around and sending his unfired weapon clattering across the floor. In the space of 3 heartbeats, Gabriel had fired 3 shots from a single-action revolver, each bullet finding its intended target with surgical precision. Both Morrison and Pete were on their knees, wounded but alive, their gun hands too damaged to pose any further threat. Dalton writhed on the floor, cradling his shattered wrist and whimpering like a beaten dog. The demonstration of skill was so overwhelming that even the wounded men stared at Gabriel with something approaching religious awe. Gabriel holstered his smoking Colt with the same fluid grace he had drawn it, the weapon sliding home with a sound like a coffin closing. He surveyed the 3 wounded men with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining his work, noting their injuries and calculating their chances of survival. All 3 would live, but they would carry the scars of this encounter for the rest of their days, physical reminders of the moment they learned there were still men in the world who demanded respect for the innocent. "The money," Gabriel said, his voice cutting through the groans and whimpers of the wounded gang members. His words carried the weight of divine commandment, brooking no argument or negotiation. Morrison, still clutching his wounded shoulder, tried to protest, but Gabriel's cold stare silenced him more effectively than a gag. With shaking hands, the big man reached into his vest and produced the roll of bills he had won from Étienne's rigged poker game. Étienne hobbled forward on his damaged leg, hardly daring to believe what had just happened. Gabriel counted out exactly $1 silver from Morrison's winnings and handed it to the young cowboy, then looked pointedly at the remaining money. "The medicine your sister needs," he said quietly, his voice gentler now but still carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "Take what you need. Nothing more." Tears streamed down Étienne's face as he selected $20 from the pile, exactly what the doctor had demanded for Celeste's medicine. His hands shook as he folded the bills and tucked them into his shirt pocket, hardly able to process the miracle that had just occurred. "How did you know?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion and wonder. Gabriel's expression softened slightly, revealing glimpses of the man beneath the legend. "A man learns to read faces in my line of work," he replied, adjusting his hat with careful precision. "Desperation has a particular look, and so does love." He glanced around the silent saloon, noting the faces of men who had witnessed something they would never forget. "These 3 won't be bothering anyone for a while, and when word spreads about what happened here tonight, others might think twice about their choices." As Gabriel moved toward the saloon's batwing doors, Henri Baptiste found his voice for the first time since the shooting began. "Monsieur Montclair," he called out in heavily accented English, his weathered hands gripping the bar for support. "Why? Why risk your life for a stranger?" The question hung in the smoky air like incense, carrying the weight of every man's curiosity about what drove a legend to intervene in ordinary cruelty. Gabriel paused at the threshold, his silhouette framed against the star-filled desert night beyond the doors. For a moment, his shoulders seemed to carry the weight of every mile he had traveled and every decision that had brought him to this place. When he turned back, his eyes found Étienne's face, and something human flickered behind the legendary killer's mask. "My brother had a twisted leg," Gabriel said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent saloon like a prayer. "Got it caught under a falling horse when he was 12. Didn't make him any less brave, any less worthy of respect." The admission hung in the air like smoke, revealing depths of pain and motivation that the legends had never captured. Bullies are the same everywhere. They pick on folks who can't fight back, thinking that makes them strong. But real strength protects the weak, doesn't prey on them. Morrison groaned from his position on the floor, trying to stanch the bleeding from his shoulder wound. "This ain't over, Montclair," he wheezed through gritted teeth. "The Crimson Creek gang has friends, has connections. You can't watch your back forever." The threat was hollow, spoken by a man whose power had just been shattered along with his gun hand, but it carried enough malice to make several patrons shift nervously. Gabriel's response was a smile that held no warmth, only the promise of consequences that would make this night's violence seem gentle by comparison. "Friend," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "I've been watching my back for 20 years. And anyone who wants to test my vigilance is welcome to try." The challenge hung in the air like a death sentence, and Morrison's face went pale as he realized he had just painted a target on his own back. Word of the confrontation spread through Serpent's Hollow faster than wildfire through dry grass. By morning, every man, woman, and child in town had heard the story of how Gabriel Montclair had humbled the Crimson Creek gang with 3 perfectly placed bullets and a code of honor that seemed to belong to a different age. The tale grew with each telling, as such stories do, but the core remained unchanged. A legend had walked among them and reminded everyone what justice looked like when it wore a gun. Étienne rode out before dawn, his sister's medicine secured in his saddlebags, and his father's silver dollar returned to his pocket where it belonged. The young cowboy's damaged leg still pained him with every step his horse took, but he sat taller in the saddle than he had in years. For the first time in his life, someone had seen past his disability to the man underneath, and that recognition had transformed him in ways that went deeper than physical healing. Dr. Francois Leblanc was waiting when Étienne arrived at the small adobe house on the outskirts of town, his black bag already prepared, and his manner suggesting he had been expecting this visit. The old physician took the $20 without comment, but his eyes held questions he was too polite to ask. As he administered the medicine to Celeste's fevered form, he found himself wondering about the miracle that had brought this desperate family the exact amount they needed. Celeste's recovery began almost immediately, color returning to her pale cheeks as the medicine worked its healing magic. She squeezed her brother's hand with strength that had been absent for days, and her fever broke before the sun reached its zenith. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice still weak but filled with love and gratitude. Étienne wanted to tell her about Gabriel Montclair, about the legendary gunslinger who had appeared like an avenging angel, but the words seemed too incredible for daylight hours. Meanwhile, back in Serpent's Hollow, the 3 members of the Crimson Creek gang were learning that their reign of terror had come to an abrupt end. Doc Williams had patched their wounds with professional efficiency but little sympathy, and they found themselves facing a town that no longer feared them. Shopkeepers who had once cowered in their presence now looked them in the eye, and former victims began sharing stories of past humiliations that demanded their own reckonings. Gabriel had taken a room at the Serpent's Hollow Hotel, a modest establishment that offered clean beds and meals without questions. He sat by the window as the sun rose over the desert, cleaning his Colt with the methodical precision of a man performing a sacred ritual. Each part of the weapon received careful attention, oiled and polished until it gleamed like burnished silver in the morning light. The ritual was more than maintenance. It was meditation, a way of processing the violence that had become as natural to him as breathing. Every bullet he fired carried weight beyond its physical impact, adding to a burden that grew heavier with each passing year. He had become a force of nature, a walking embodiment of frontier justice. But the cost of that transformation was a loneliness that cut deeper than any bullet wound. A soft knock at his door interrupted the morning routine. Gabriel opened it to find a small girl, no more than 8 years old, holding a plate covered with a checkered cloth. "Mama sent this," she said shyly, her eyes wide with the mixture of fear and fascination that children reserved for legends and monsters. "She said to thank you for helping the lame cowboy." Gabriel accepted the plate with a gentleness that would have surprised the men he had shot the night before. Beneath the cloth lay fresh biscuits, bacon, and eggs, simple food prepared with care and offered as payment for a debt that couldn't be measured in money. "Tell your mama I'm grateful," he said softly, his voice losing its edge when addressing the innocent. "And tell her to teach you to be kind to folks who are different. The world needs more kindness and less cruelty." The child nodded solemnly and scampered away, leaving Gabriel alone with his thoughts and a breakfast that tasted better than any meal he had eaten in years. Through the window, he could see the Silver Dollar Saloon across the street, its doors open to the morning air as Henri Baptiste swept the previous night's violence away with sawdust and determination. The cycle continued, violence begetting violence, justice demanding its price, and legends walking the earth to balance scales that seemed perpetually tilted toward cruelty. 3 days later, just as Serpent's Hollow was beginning to settle back into its routine, riders appeared on the eastern horizon. The dust cloud they raised was visible for miles across the desert floor, and experienced eyes counted at least a dozen horses moving at speed toward the town. Henri Baptiste lowered his telescope with hands that had begun to shake again, recognizing the banner that flew above the approaching group, the Crimson Creek that had given Morrison's gang its name. The reinforcements arrived like a plague of locusts, armed men who had heard about their leader's humiliation and come seeking revenge. They were harder and meaner than Morrison's original crew, veterans of range wars and Indian fights who wore their scars like badges of honor. Their leader was Joaquin Valdez, a half-Mexican gunfighter whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his skill with a blade and pistol. Valdez dismounted in front of the Silver Dollar with the casual arrogance of a man who had never met his match. His silver spurs chimed like funeral bells as he walked, and the ivory handles of his twin Colts gleamed in the afternoon sun. Behind him, his men spread out in a practiced formation that spoke of military experience and professional violence. They had come to restore their gang's reputation, and they intended to wash away the previous night's shame with blood. "Where is he?" Valdez called out as he pushed through the saloon's batwing doors, his voice carrying the accent of the borderlands and the authority of absolute confidence. The few patrons who had been drinking at this early hour quickly found reasons to be elsewhere, leaving only Henri behind the bar to face the storm that was about to break. "Where is the man who dared to harm my hermanos?" Gabriel appeared at the top of the hotel stairs across the street, as if summoned by the challenge in Valdez's voice. He descended slowly, each step measured and deliberate, his black duster flowing around him like the wings of a dark angel. The afternoon sun cast his shadow long across the dusty street, and his spurs sang their own song of approaching death. When he stepped into the street, 12 men turned to face him, but he showed no more concern than if he were walking to Sunday service. Valdez emerged from the saloon with his men arrayed behind him like pieces on a chessboard, each positioned to provide maximum firepower while minimizing the chance of hitting their own. It was a formation that had served them well in previous conflicts, designed to overwhelm even the most skilled opponent through sheer volume of lead. They had used it to destroy Apache war parties and crush resistance from rival gangs, and they saw no reason why it should fail them now. Gabriel stopped in the center of the street, equidistant from all threats, his positioning as precise as a mathematical equation. He had faced similar odds before and survived through a combination of speed, accuracy, and the kind of cold calculation that turned gunfights into geometry problems. His hands hung loose at his sides, fingers relaxed but ready, his entire body poised like a spring waiting for release. "You made a mistake, gringo," Valdez called out, his voice carrying across the empty street like a death sentence. "You humiliated my men. Cost them face and blood. That kind of insult demands payment in kind." His hands hovered over his twin Colts, ivory handles worn smooth by years of practice and violence. "I'm going to kill you slow, make you suffer for every drop of blood you spilled." The townspeople had vanished like smoke, disappearing into buildings and hiding behind whatever cover they could find. Shutters slammed closed along the main street. And the only sound was the whisper of wind through empty doorways and the nervous shifting of horses tied to hitching posts. Even the dogs seemed to sense the approaching violence, slinking away to find safe places to wait out the storm. Gabriel's response was silence, the same eloquent lack of words that had preceded the previous night's violence. But this time, his right hand moved with deliberate slowness to his coat, not toward his gun, but toward something else entirely. He withdrew a silver pocket watch, clicked it open with his thumb, and studied the face with the casual interest of a man checking the time for an appointment. The gesture was loaded with meaning. He was giving his opponents one last chance to reconsider their choices. Valdez misread Gabriel's gesture as contempt, and his professional pride demanded immediate response. "Now!" he shouted, his hands flying to his guns as his men opened fire from a dozen different angles. The street erupted in thunder and smoke, muzzle flashes lighting the afternoon like deadly fireworks. Lead filled the air where Gabriel had been standing, but the legendary gunslinger was already moving, rolling, and diving with inhuman speed. Gabriel's Colt appeared in his hand like magic, spitting fire and death with mechanical precision. His first shot took Valdez through the shoulder, spinning the gang leader around and sending one of his prized pistols flying into the dirt. The second shot dropped the man directly behind Valdez, a clean hit through the heart that killed instantly. By the time Gabriel's third shot rang out, he was behind a water trough, using its metal sides for cover while his enemies tried to adjust their aim. The gunfight that followed was like nothing Serpent's Hollow had ever witnessed. Gabriel moved like a phantom, appearing at one window to fire, then vanishing before return shots could find him. He used every piece of cover the street offered: rain barrels, hitching posts, the corner of the general store, always staying ahead of his enemy's ability to predict his movements. Each shot he fired found its mark, wounding rather than killing, demonstrating a level of control that bordered on the supernatural. One by one, Valdez's men fell or fled, their formation dissolving under the pressure of facing an opponent who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The street filled with groans and curses as wounded outlaws tried to crawl to safety, their earlier confidence shattered along with their bones. Gabriel had turned their numerical advantage against them, using their positioning to create confusion and friendly fire incidents that demoralized the survivors. When the smoke finally cleared, Gabriel stood alone in the center of the street, his Colt smoking in his hand and his black duster unmarked by enemy bullets. Around him lay the evidence of his impossible victory, 11 men wounded but alive, testament to his skill and his adherence to a code that valued justice over simple vengeance. Valdez himself sat in the dirt, clutching his wounded shoulder and staring at Gabriel with the expression of a man who had just witnessed a miracle. Gabriel reloaded his Colt with movements so smooth they seemed choreographed, each brass cartridge sliding home with the precision of a master craftsman at work. The surviving gang members watched him with the fascination of men observing their own executioner, too shocked by their defeat to feel immediate fear. They had been professional killers, men who lived by violence and expected to die by it. But they had never encountered anything like the force that had just dismantled their entire organization. Valdez struggled to his feet, his wounded arm hanging useless at his side and his remaining gun forgotten in the dirt. Blood seeped through his fingers as he pressed his good hand against the shoulder wound, but his eyes never left Gabriel's face. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice carrying genuine awe alongside the pain. "What are you?" Gabriel holstered his weapon with the same fluid grace he had drawn it, the motion completing a ritual that had become as natural as breathing. "I'm a man who got tired of watching bullies win," he replied, his voice carrying across the silent street like a eulogy for the age of unchecked violence. "I'm what happens when someone decides that enough is enough." The townspeople began emerging from their hiding places, faces pale with shock and wonder at what they had witnessed. Children peeked around door frames while their parents stepped cautiously into the street, hardly daring to believe that the nightmare was truly over. The Crimson Creek gang had been the terror of the territory for years, and seeing them broken and bleeding in the dust seemed like something from a fever dream. Dr. LeBlanc appeared with his black bag, moving among the wounded with professional efficiency, despite his obvious fear. Gabriel nodded to the physician and began walking toward the hotel, his part in the drama complete. Behind him, Valdez called out one last question that stopped the gunslinger in his tracks. "Will you kill us now? Finish what you started?" The query carried no bravado, only the resigned curiosity of a man facing his fate. Gabriel turned back to face the wounded gang leader, his weathered features impossible to read in the afternoon shadows. For a long moment, the street was silent, except for the groans of injured men and the distant sound of Dr. LeBlanc tearing cloth for bandages. When Gabriel finally spoke, his words carried the weight of years spent walking the knife's edge between justice and vengeance. "Killing you would be easy," he said, his voice carrying no threat, only statement of fact. "But easy isn't always right. You're all going to live with what happened here today. Carry the memory of being beaten by one man standing alone against 12. That knowledge will follow you wherever you go, whatever you do next." His cold blue eyes swept across the scattered survivors, marking each face with the precision of a man who never forgot anything important. Valdez winced as Dr. LeBlanc began cleaning his wound, but his attention remained fixed on Gabriel with the intensity of a student trying to understand a master's lesson. "Why?" he asked through gritted teeth. "We came here to kill you. We would have shown no mercy if the situation were reversed." The question hung in the air like smoke, carrying the bewilderment of a man whose world view had just been shattered. "Because mercy is what separates men from animals," Gabriel replied, adjusting his hat with careful precision. "Because someone has to draw the line between justice and murder, especially when, that line gets blurry." He paused, studying the faces of the townspeople who had gathered to witness this moment of unexpected grace. "And because killing you all wouldn't bring back any of the people you've hurt over the years." The wisdom in those words cut deeper than bullets ever could, leaving wounds that would never fully heal. Gabriel had given the surviving gang members something more valuable and more terrible than death. He had given them the burden of living with their choices, of seeing their reflection in every mirror and knowing what they had become. Some men would be broken by that knowledge, while others might find redemption in it. But none would ever be the same. As Dr. LeBlanc continued his work on the wounded, a small crowd gathered around Gabriel in front of the hotel. These were the ordinary people of Serpent's Hollow, shopkeepers and farmers, wives and children, folks who had lived in fear for so long they had almost forgotten what safety felt like. Now they looked at the legendary gunslinger with a mixture of gratitude and wonder, as if he were some mythical figure stepped down from the pages of a dime novel. "What happens now?" asked Maria Santos, the baker's wife, her voice carrying the uncertainty of a woman who had watched her world transform in the space of 20 minutes. "They'll come back, won't they? Bring more men? More guns?" The fear in her voice was echoed in the faces around her, people who had learned that hope was a luxury they couldn't afford in a land where might made right. Gabriel considered the question with the gravity it deserved, understanding that his answer would shape how these people lived for years to come. "Some might," he admitted, his honesty cutting through false comfort like a blade through silk. "But word travels fast in this territory. What happened here today will be told and retold until it becomes legend. Most men aren't eager to face those kinds of odds, especially when they know the ending to the story." Henri Baptiste pushed through the crowd, his weathered face creased with emotions too complex for easy naming. In his hands he carried Gabriel's hat, retrieved from the hotel where the gunslinger had left it before the fight. "Monsieur," he said formally, offering the hat with both hands like a sacred relic. You have given us something we thought was lost forever. How do we repay such a debt?" Gabriel accepted his hat with a nod of thanks, settling it on his steel-gray hair with the care of a man performing a ritual. "You repay it by remembering," he said simply. "Remember that there's always a choice between right and wrong, even when that choice is hard. Remember that real strength protects the weak instead of preying on them. And remember that sometimes one person standing up can make all the difference in the world." The sun was setting behind the desert mountains when Gabriel finally prepared to leave Serpent's Hollow. Painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to reflect the day's violence and redemption. His horse, a steel-gray stallion that matched his owner's coloring, waited patiently at the hitching post, saddled and ready for whatever journey lay ahead. The animal's calm demeanor spoke of shared experiences and mutual trust forged through years of dangerous travel. Étienne Dubois appeared as Gabriel was checking his saddlebags, the young cowboy moving with more confidence than he had shown since arriving in town. His sister Celeste walked beside him, pale but steady on her feet, her recovery nothing short of miraculous. They approached the legendary gunslinger with the reverence of pilgrims meeting a saint, their faces shining with gratitude that transcended words. "I don't know how to thank you," Étienne began, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my sister's life, gave me back my dignity, and showed me what it means to stand up for what's right." His damaged leg still pained him, but he stood straighter now, carrying himself with the bearing of a man who had been valued by someone who mattered. Gabriel studied the young couple with eyes that held depths of experience far beyond his years. "You thank me by living well," he said quietly. "By treating others with the kindness you would want for yourself. By standing up when you see wrong being done, even when it's easier to look away." His words carried the weight of a lifetime spent learning these lessons the hard way. Celeste stepped forward with shy determination, pulling something from her pocket. A small wooden cross carved with intricate patterns that spoke of hours of careful work. "For protection," she whispered, pressing it into Gabriel's weathered hands. "So you'll remember that someone prays for your safety every night." The simple gift carried more value than gold or silver, a reminder that even legends were human beings worthy of love and concern. Gabriel mounted his stallion as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, his silhouette already taking on the mythical quality that stories would attach to it in years to come. The wooden cross from Celeste rested in his shirt pocket, close to his heart, a tangible reminder of why he had chosen this path despite its terrible cost. Behind him, the lights of Serpent's Hollow began to twinkle like earthbound stars, marking a place where justice had triumphed and innocence had been protected. The surviving members of the Crimson Creek gang would scatter to the winds, carrying tales of their defeat that would grow with each telling. Some would find honest work, haunted by the mercy they had been shown and struggling to become worthy of it. Others would continue their violent ways until they met men less forgiving than Gabriel Montclair. But all would remember the day a legend had walked among them and reminded them that actions have consequences, even for those who thought themselves above earthly justice. As Gabriel rode into the desert night, he could feel the weight of Celeste's cross against his chest, and the lighter weight of knowledge that he had made a difference in lives that mattered. The lonely path of the wandering gunslinger stretched before him, leading to other towns where bullies preyed on the innocent and someone needed to draw the line between right and wrong. It was a burden he had chosen freely, and one he would carry until his final sunset. In the years that followed, the story of what happened in Serpent's Hollow would be told around campfires and in saloons across the frontier. Bards would sing of the lame cowboy who found a protector, the gunslinger who chose mercy over vengeance, and the moment when one man's courage inspired an entire town to stand up for what was right. The details would change with each telling, But the heart of the story would remain constant. Sometimes, when darkness seems strongest, a single light can drive it away. Gabriel Montclair disappeared into legend that night, riding toward whatever destiny awaited him beyond the horizon. But his legacy lived on in the lives he had touched, the bullies he had humbled, and the reminder that in a world where might often made right, there were still those who chose to be righteous instead. The circle was complete, justice had been served, and somewhere in the vast expanse of the American frontier, a legend continued his eternal ride toward the next place where he was needed most.